Welcome to the second foundational episode of American WASP, where we all agree you don't get change in America by asking nicely. I am your host, Deter McBizness, New England's favorite white Anglo-Saxon Protestant living in Southern California. This episode will be my attempt to establish my credibility as something of an authority on the subject of the WASP Worldview, which, I argue, constitutes the ideological foundation of Reaganism, which has since mutated into present-day Trumpism. If you're tired, like I am, of hearing political commentators struggle to explain Trump's base by exclaiming things like, "How could any American support this narcissistic idiot, much less 63 million voters in 2016? Take a good hard look at the origins of white society in this country, leaving out the Catholics, of course. And the idea of supporting someone like Trump won't seem so absurd. I know the WASPs inside and out because I spent the first 2 decades of my life being surrounded by every size, color, and shape WASP you can think of. I suppose they're all the same color, though. To understand WASP conservatism is to understand American conservatism. To put it biblically, you might say the insights I offer here are the keys to the kingdom of comprehending conservative cognition. This episode is part of a series called Drugstore Psychology, where I attempt to explain why people are the way they are according to demographic and psychographic variables, such as the socioeconomic status of the family in which someone was raised, where they were raised, urban, suburban, rural, the educational opportunities made available to someone and the extent to which that person took advantage of those opportunities. Not just whether or not you went to school, but where you went to school and how well you did while you were there. Life experience variables, such as how much someone has traveled or done community service work, how much money they've made or inherited, whether the person is predisposed to athletics or the arts. Even birth order can be insightful. Using demographic and psychographic data points such as these invokes my fifth Deter Dichotomy, an age-old question I'm sure you are all familiar with and have pondered before: nature versus nurture. Since I became an uncle 8 years ago, my views on this dichotomy have shifted slightly, because I've seen that kids do indeed come out of the womb with some strong personality predispositions. The question of whether or not someone is a product of their environment, however, depends on what aspect of their life you're evaluating. So, leaving personality aside for the real psychologist to evaluate, I speculate that most people's worldview is well over 80% determined by the circumstances of their life, circumstances like the variables I just listed, leading up to their mid-20s. Not coincidentally, according to psychology, 18 to 24 is typically the most impressionable age range in someone's life, with more of their opinions changing in those years than any other time period. Dramatic events can take place after the mid-20s, which might transform a conservative into a liberal or vice versa, but those cases are few and far between. Those stories, often presented as redemptive or seductively unique, play well in mass media, but only because they are the exception, not the norm. Stories about atypical people draw larger audiences than stories about typical people, because typical people are boring. Until you've been out of school for a couple of years and actually experienced real independence, there's still a chance that an outside force might influence your worldview, but once you start paying your own taxes, buying your own health care, and start to think about having kids, your raw, real, when no one is looking opinion of humanity is crystallized. Before I delineate the evolution of my personal politics, I feel compelled to offer this intellectual disclaimer. Those who seek to influence others, especially within the context of politics and religion, as I am doing right now, must practice what they preach if their message is to survive criticism, lest they be labeled hypocrites. To invoke the gospel according to Matthew, judge not, lest ye be judged. So please, feel free to judge me. Because I'm going to be doing a lot of unapologetic judging of others over the course of this show. Express those judgments of me in the comments section below, because they'll only make me a better advocate for progressive change. I know how YouTube works, so for all you Trumplicans hate watching this right now, first of all, thank you for your attention, and secondly, know that I accept your feelings toward me in the same way the greatest president of the 20th century accepted his detractors more than 80 years ago. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. The great irony of my personal journey leading up to the launch of this show is that the reason for my comprehensive understanding of all things WASP is the same reason why I've outright rejected the subculture's values and views: my loving mother and father. I was only able to transcend the ignorance of my privileged upbringing because of the educational opportunities they provided. So before I continue, I want to be clear. I am grateful to my parents for providing me with those amazing opportunities. I justify my harsh criticism of the WASP worldview as both the least mature and least empathetic of any American tribe by arguing that their relentless resistance to any kind of change is the single biggest obstacle to America becoming the great society we all want it to be. The society we were promised it would be by now. When so many members of the voting public resist change for no better reason other than it is change, it should be no surprise that the country struggles to socioculturally evolve. They want to preserve the status quo because they are the status quo. Why would they want the system to change? As far as they're concerned, even though most of them are dead wrong about this, the system works for them. No other relationship between political factions has influenced American society more in the last 40 years than the alliance between rural uneducated whites, most of whom have become Trumplicans, and white one-percenters, most of whom have become the primary beneficiaries of Trump's economic policies. The emotional bond of this alliance is the inauthentic, narcissistic social entitlement that I defined in my previous episode. That sense of entitlement, that we own this country because we built this country, even though that proclamation is far from true, has been promoted by elite WASPs to manipulate evangelical WASPs into voting against their own economic interests. I know that understanding of Republican political strategy since Reagan might not sound particularly original, but when I dive into the details of that alliance in the next few episodes, you'll come to appreciate that any strategic plan for long-term left-wing political success must include intentionally offensive tactics. Because playing not to lose might work in 2020, but it won't in future elections. For now, let me explain how the first 2 decades of my life entitle me to the privilege of judging the 3 major feathers of right-wing American conservatism. Let's call this my second Deter 3. Right-wing religious, right-wing military, and right-wing corporate America. I get to judge them all because I know them all. I know them all not by choice, but by chance. No one chooses the circumstances of their early life, but I am grateful for mine because they endowed me with a special kind of comprehension of the conservative psyche that I am now attempting to share with you. I spent the first 23 years of my life aspiring to become a waspy one-percenter in my own right. So you're listening to someone with all kinds of credibility when it comes to explaining the cognitive tendencies of the ruling class of America and their electoral demographic base, because I come from that world and consciously left it because I became aware of its decidedly negative effect on American society at large. Let me explain. If you had asked me when I was a freshman at Vanderbilt what I expected my life to be like after college, I probably would have said something like, I want to get a top-shelf job in corporate America so that a few years later I can go to Harvard Business School. By the time I'm 35, I'm 36 now, by the way, I expect to have a few $1,000,000 in the bank, a hot wife, at least 2 smart and athletic kids, at least 2 homes, maybe a boat, and take at least 2 lavish vacations each year. Because I love to ski. What actually happened was my childish but passionate defense of George W. Bush and the Republican Party went up in smoke when I saw Fahrenheit 9/11 while studying abroad in New Zealand. 5 years after that, I produced an activism documentary of my own about offshore wind energy in Massachusetts. A kid who actively rooted against Al Gore in 2000 produced an environmental activism movie 8 years later. What the hell happened? Well, as you might imagine, I did a lot of self-reflection for this episode. And upon doing so, I realized that the 180 in my political perspective came about in 3 phases. First, I was conditioned to value relationships with people that are different from me at a very young age by attending a very small, 50 guys a grade, all-male private high school where the only things my classmates and I had in common were that we were all guys, all pretty sharp, and all eager to learn. Over half of them were on financial aid, and the school was already very affordable to begin with compared to other private high schools in the area, so unlike most privileged white kids from the suburbs, I actually had a diverse group of friends growing up from inner-city Boston. We all still keep in touch to this day through a group text chat that frequently blows up with fiery political arguments. Without even realizing it, my 6 years at Roxbury Latin didn't just make me tolerant of people that are different from me. They actually made me want to know people that are different from me. Genuine social interest in those that are different from you doesn't have to derive from education, but it did for me. I work in the entertainment business, and what outsiders don't realize is that the best part of Hollywood isn't the parties. It's that Hollywood is a magnet for people who are genuinely interested in knowing those that are different from them. Working with people that are different from you. How much fun is that, can you imagine? Why are Hollywoodites so interested in people that are different from them? Because that's storytelling. The second phase of my path to progressivism came when I studied abroad in New Zealand. And yes, it really is that beautiful. After 2 years of awkwardly navigating the social politics of a college experience that can best be described as Southern rich kid frat culture, which is a lot of fun, to be clear. Spending almost half a year with people from all over the world in what is arguably the most beautiful country in the world reminded me of how good it feels to socialize with people that are different from me, since Vandy was certainly not the most diverse academic institution, even though I understand that it is much more so today. Those 5 months in New Zealand introduced me to the idea that humans have a moral obligation to take care of our planet, and taught me that the history of the human race, just as our present-day global economy, is defined by change. So to be predisposed to resist it, which is the definition of conservatism, is only a manifestation of a fear-driven worldview. Still reluctant to take Michael more seriously, but really just scared to death that this would indeed become the table-turning intellectual moment of my entire life, and that ideological about-face would somehow make me less of a man. After hearing every local Kiwi and every study-abroad student rave about it, I finally saw Fahrenheit 9/11, and it did not disappoint. Seeing that film made me realize how much damage mass media, which was also coincidentally my major at Vandy, had done to public conscience, because no matter what you think of Michael Moore's personality, Fahrenheit 9/11 is a fact and data-driven exposure of conservative politics as the means by which the wealthiest Americans manipulate the most ignorant Americans into politically supporting the interests of the top 1% in corporations. rather than their own. Up until then, I defended conservatism by invoking its cliché principles of individual responsibility, fiscal responsibility, yeah, remember that one, and small government. But Michael Moore's incredible research opened my eyes to the ugly truth that when it comes to the politics of our Western democracy, conservatism cloaks itself in cultural crusading to defend the economic interests of the status quo. Let's call that my third Deter Decree. W was also reelected while I was in New Zealand. There was hope among my liberal friends that Kerry could upset a wartime president, but that wartime context and, let's be serious, Karl Rove's political genius proved to be too much for the post-Clinton stuffed shirt Democrats. I'm embarrassed to say that I was secretly somewhat pleased that W won re-election in 2004, and I suspect it was because I saw the Democratic Party then in much the same way as I do today. A party of losers. My study abroad experience combined with seeing Fahrenheit 9/11 had yet to influence my worldview definitively. I was becoming more aware, however, that I was indeed looking, as Trumplicans do today, at politics as if they are a team sport. We conservative tough guys defending America against you deadbeat liberal losers looking for a handout. Little did I know, a colossal shift in my worldview was about to take place. In the third and final phase of my political transformation upon my arrival back at Vanderbilt, I was warmly greeted by a new batch of friends my other friends had incorporated into our social circle while I was gone. They were, for the most part, flaming liberals, and none of them were from the South. Making memories with them over the next 3 semesters combined with the most intense streak of studying I've ever experienced to produce a complete reorientation of my political perspective. At that time, I still really wanted that corporate America job, so I knew I had to graduate at least magna cum laude with Phi Beta Kappa honors to get it. So as a byproduct of working hard academically to get a good GPA so I could get a competitive corporate job right out of college, I learned a great deal about American society with a particular focus on the politics of the 80s and 90s, the evolution of communication technology over the course of the 20th century, particularly 24-hour news and the internet, as well as a tremendous appreciation for who I and many scholars consider to be the father of Western civilization, Sir Winston Churchill. By the time I graduated, I had done so much research on recent American history that I could no longer intellectually stave off the ugly truths left-wing America had been spouting about right-wing America for decades. The same ugly truths that were showcased in Moore's masterpiece, and the same ugly truths so many of my friends back in Boston had tried to help me see when I was younger. I grew up in a very conservative household, but that household was surrounded by the capital of American liberalism. Part of the reason Boston has that reputation is because it is the Athens of America, with more academic institutions in its vicinity than any other city in the country. So my friends' parents were almost all really well-educated liberals, being professors at MIT and Harvard, physicians, lawyers, judges, CEOs, and even publicly elected officials, all of whom were Democrats. After graduating college, I was well on my way to becoming the progressive I am today, but first I had to do a year in corporate America, which I hated, so I left. A year working on movies in New Orleans, and a year making my aforementioned documentary on Cape Cod before heading to UCLA Film School in the summer of 2010. Over the next 10 years, I would spend more and more time becoming an active citizen, but that interest in politics grew 10 times when Trump shocked the world in 2016. Speaking of Trump in 2016, this is one of the more interesting election night stories you'll hear. I was texting away to friends and family about the disaster we were witnessing unfold when I received a group text from an old high school friend of mine who's black, as were several other recipients. The message included this: a picture of my parents on either side of Trump proudly posted on my mother's Facebook wall. It was taken at a fundraiser hosted by Bill Koch, the third and much lesser-known Koch brother, but still very much a politically active billionaire. You see, I'm not friends with my mom on Facebook, but my buddy is. He sat on this picture for 3 months and sent with it one of the more epic texts I've ever received. "Hey Tar, tell your mother we forgive her. She was always nice to us whenever we came over to the house." I laughed for a few seconds, as I'm sure you are right now, but the fun was quickly drowned out by a feeling of betrayal because I knew about this fundraiser. And I asked my dad earlier that summer if he and his friends were planning on going. He said a few of them were, but he wasn't. So my old man straight up lied to me about publicly and financially supporting Trump for president. My folks have given money to presidential hopefuls in the past, but they've never paid to have their picture taken with the candidate. That kind of public display is a far cry from sending a few $100 to George W. Bush in 2000, I'm sure you would agree. I've tried to explain to them that it's one thing to vote against Hillary, but it's quite another to publicly and financially support Trump, because having your picture taken with a politician, particularly when you pay for that picture, attaches your reputation to theirs. Typically, that public display of support doesn't really change the way your friends and family look at you, because politics and religion are topics of conversation we're taught to avoid when we're young. But this pick did for me. And it has for many other friends and family of loud and proud Trumplicans. Trump isn't like any politician we've ever seen. Supporting him isn't the same thing as supporting W or Reagan. Supporting him has reputational consequences, whether Trumplicans like it or not. I knew they'd never vote Democrat, but I thought Trump might wake them up to the ugly truth. Are you starting to recognize a theme here? That their party was no longer an intellectually legitimate form of conservatism. Back when Trump was hosting The Apprentice, my dad actually joked about how much of a failure Trump was in real estate. That all the people he knew who worked in commercial real estate looked down on Trump as some kind of wannabe player who never actually got to the big leagues. A joke within the industry. After all, the guy went bankrupt 6 times. Count them, 6 times. You know how hard it is to bankrupt a casino? My old man admitted that the only reason Trump has fame and fortune is because he became a reality TV star, not because he was a successful real estate entrepreneur. This may be a rationalization, but since I knew my dad didn't respect Trump as a legitimately successful businessman, that he lied to me about attending that fundraiser is actually a good thing. I'm choosing to look at it this way, because it tells me that he was actually embarrassed to have gone to that event, and likely only did so because my mother pressured him into it. He also likely felt a decent amount of peer pressure from his country club crew of friends, but neither of those influences are excuses. They do, however, constitute an explanation for his choice to attend that makes me think my dad is not actually an overgrown child, unlike most Trumplicans, particularly 1%er Trumplicans. I honestly believe he knows he was wrong to publicly and financially support Trump in 2016. I know he regrets it. But I also know he's way too damn proud to ever admit he regrets it. CEOs, after all, aren't known for their humility. I knew my mother would jump at the chance to publicly and financially support Trump, but I just didn't think my dad would accommodate it. Without getting into too many details about what she said about Obama, let's just say her Southern evangelical heritage informed the way she would talk about our first black president. I know that night sucked for a lot of people, but it sucked for me in a special way, because not only did Trump win, but my family helped him win. And all my friends now knew it. I couldn't help but be embarrassed. And whenever I tell that story, it always gets a hearty laugh from listeners, but always let people know after they're done laughing that it's funny for them because they're not your family. When the Trump campaign contributors are not only members of your family, but the founders of your family, you only laugh to prevent yourself from crying because, to be perfectly frank, Their public announcement of that political allegiance means that I will only respect their intellects again if they surprise the hell out of me by admitting they were wrong to attend that fundraiser. Repentance, ironically enough, since that's a big word in Christianity, does not come naturally to conservatives, much less 1%er WASP conservatives. So before I break my promise of implying that my folks are bad people because they are Trumplicans, let me tell you a little bit about them. My dad, put simply, is the American dream. He came from humble beginnings on Long Island to attend the U.S. Naval Academy. My family's connection to the Navy runs deep, with my mother's father serving as a minesweeper in North Africa during World War II, while my father's father captained an amphibious vehicle to transport troops to Omaha Beach on D-Day. My Cold Warrior father spent his 5 years of naval service as a nuclear engineer on submarines chasing the Soviets under the polar ice cap. Fun fact, it's something of a submariner tradition to play a game of football on the surface of the polar ice cap. As you can see in the photograph, yes, our submarines reach the surface by simply punching through the ice with the submarine's sail. Pretty damn cool. After serving his country, Chief, as my brothers and I like to call him, would go on to attend Harvard Business School and Tufts Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Then, instead of pursuing a PhD in economics, he decided to climb the corporate ladder to become a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. If you met him, you'd probably find him to be polite, quiet, but subtly intense. He tries to play it off, but my dad is one of the most competitive men I know. His resume indicates as much. No one works that hard if they aren't obsessed with winning. Perhaps the most interesting thing about my dad with respect to understanding the psychology of the self-made 1%er is that his competitiveness came about as a byproduct of having to survive. He wasn't given anything in his life, so I suspect that at some point, without even knowing it, he equated surviving to winning. And while it served him well in his professional life, I'll be honest, the guy struggles to enjoy his success. Now that you know my dad, if Archie Bunker were a CEO, it's time to meet Livia Soprano. I mean my mom. Just kidding, Mom. She doesn't even understand that reference because The Sopranos is too violent for her. She hails from Virginia Beach, which is a much deeper part of the South than you would guess from looking at it on a map. They definitely like their Confederate flags, their Bibles, and probably their guns down there, or at least they definitely did back in the 1950s and 60s. She was the oldest of 3 girls born into an upper-middle-class cattle family. Not only did she not have any brothers, but her education was exclusively and somewhat ironically feminine, attending an all-girls high school and college before she married my dad at 21. After a couple years of being a teacher for kids with learning disabilities, a career I strongly wish she had stuck with, she, a Southern evangelical born-again Christian, raised a family of 3 boys surrounded by the liberal elite of New England. She and I were probably at our closest when I went to God Camp in Martha's Vineyard back-to-back summers. I thought it'd be a good way to meet girls since none went to my high school, and I was right. But since real Christians saved themselves for marriage, having youth ministry serve as the basis for my social life was a short-lived venture. Something that does separate my folks from roughly 1/3 of their peer group is that they were not born into 1%er privilege. They worked their way into that status, and if you ask my father, never really expected to achieve that level of material success. That's what I was referring to a minute ago about him not realizing that at some point he conflated surviving and winning. That revelation of their own expectations for life, that they never expected to achieve the level of material success that they did. That all they really cared about was educating their kids and raising them in a comfortable suburb. Upper middle class was their aspiration, not country club 1%er. Understanding that contextual element of their life experience explains to me why they are so unaware of how their superlative privilege has corrupted the integrity of their worldview and made them resistant to almost any alternative perspective. Just as I like to define empathy as an acknowledgement of ignorance, I have no idea what it's like to be you, and you have no idea what it's like to be me, so too do I prefer to define perhaps just as ubiquitous a word in public discourse these days, privilege, as a specific circumstance. Privilege begins where material needs end. My fourth Deter Decree explains the psychological effect of privilege. The price of privilege is a prison of expectations. The greater the privilege, the greater the expectations. You might have noticed that this decree sounds like a combination of my first Deter Decree, we are all prisoners of our own personal experience, and my fourth Deter Dichotomy, wants versus shoulds, also understood as desires versus expectations. Those kinds of intellectual synergies give me hope that I'm offering something useful here. Commentary that you can take with you into daily conversation that will shed light on how the status quo of today's America came to be, why it is so difficult to challenge the status quo, and by extension, the concerted effort the post-baby boomer generations will have to make to overcome it. Even if you're talking with a baby boomer conservative, these Deterisms will serve as fantastic conversation facilitators. I promise. One point of recognition I would like to make in the event Archie and Livia are watching, my folks did do an excellent job of making us aware of how blessed we were to never have to worry about food on the table so that we could focus on not whether we would go to college, but which top-shelf college we would choose to attend. Unfortunately, they never learned the inverse lesson from us, that privilege can adversely affect the worldview of adults who come from humble beginnings, as they do. Their earned superlative success has psychological consequences of which they are completely unaware. The difference between the worldviews of my parents and their sons constitutes the premise for my sixth and arguably my favorite Deter Dichotomy, because it just might be the best way to understand anyone. Survivors versus Explorers. You've thought about this before with your friends and family, but you've likely used other words to describe the two directions of this psychological fork in the road. Maybe fear-driven versus hope-driven? That's a popular one. I choose survivors and explorers because it suggests that even if someone's life does revolve around the reality of having to make material ends meet, as most people's lives do, there's still room for them to have an exploratory spiritual journey. Put another way, experiential happiness isn't only available to people with money. Survivors follow the money. Explorers follow their passions. Survivors don't respond well to the unpredictable. Explorers don't let their unmet expectations ruin their mood. Survivors surround themselves with the look and like-minded. Explorers seek out those that are different from them, traveling being the most obvious example. The elephant in the room that becomes visible when you start to look at people in your life according to this dichotomy is that your survivor friends are boring, while your explorer friends are fun. Connecting my fourth Deter Decree with my sixth Deter Dichotomy explains the tragic reality of many self-made one-percenters. They never learn how to transition from survivors to explorers because they are trapped in an emotional prison of expectations only white one-percenter privilege can produce. Most people are survivors because they have to be. Most people, even in the ever-shrinking middle class of America, work to provide for themselves and their families. Many people in corporate America don't actually like their jobs, particularly finance executives. Many of them work in that space for the money. The really successful banker bros eventually treat investing like a really sophisticated game, which is why they become so good at it. The point is, many one-percenter WASPs never shed their obsession with success to actually enjoy their success. I alluded to one of the behavioral outcomes of this understanding of the one-percenter WASP worldview in my previous episode by describing the crotchety old man who spends most of his free time complaining about mundane minutia when he should be on cruises in Alaska. Much of our current public discourse rightfully revolves around the experience of the oppressed and the marginalized. But I argue that the key to success within the context of political conflict is understanding your opposition. In simpler terms, let's call this my fifth Deter Decree. Defeating your enemy demands that you know your enemy. Not to suggest that today's Trumplicans are crypto-Nazis, although their views do reek of authoritarianism. The aforementioned Sir Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain in 1940, 9 months following the outbreak of World War II, because he was an expert on Germany. He paid attention to Hitler in the 1930s when every other political leader in Europe dismissed him as a powerless, failed artist with a funny mustache. Just as Churchill understood German fascism better than any other Brit in the 1940s, I submit that I understand conservatism in the age of Trump better than any other American today. By explaining to the general public why the right is the way it is and how it mutated from Reaganism to Trumpism over the past 40 years, I aspire to convince as many Americans as I can that at least 1/3 of the voting public are simply unreasonable people. Unreasonable people that would rather die than admit someone different from them knows better than they do. Yes, they would rather die than admit someone different from them knows better than they do. That quintessentially Trumplican, never admit you're wrong attitude justifies a complete overhaul of left-wing political messaging. Now that I have articulated my judgment of the ruling class of America in my first episode and justified that judgment by telling you the story of my own politics in this episode, I will next explain in greater detail the emotional manipulation one-percenter conservatives use to persuade non-one-percenter conservatives into voting against their own economic interests. After that, I'll transition into answering the most important question of all. What are we going to do about it? Thank you once again for your attention. Please like, share, subscribe, find me on Twitter, and email me with stuff you would like to be discussed on this show. I'm trying to crank out as many episodes as I can between now and Election Day. I'll conclude this second episode, which will definitely be the most personal one I ever do, by offering a simple suggestion. Whenever politics or American society in general comes up in conversation with friends or family, try to establish agreement on this one point. The McBizness maxim, if you will. You don't get change in America by asking nicely. Then tell them to listen to me to find out why.